Snowy by Jonathan Weil. Snowy. The voice was right in his ear, snapping him out of the grey, half-dreaming zone that he drifted into while walking. Her voice. It could have been a comment on the conditions, the snow, the moonlight, the country road flat white, but he knew better. She hadn't called him Snowy in ages. The sound of it brought back a memory, years ago, curled up in her single bed in the Catford flat, she stroking his hair. Snowy, 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 softly, over and over. And then that little laugh she used to do, soft and private, barely exiting her body, sweet with tenderness and regret. He must still be in the grey zone because he could hear that laugh now, weaving in and out of the hawthorn and holly to either side of him. It would be spooky were it not so obviously her, ghostly if he didn't know for a fact that she was alive and well, sitting in the car, probably pissed off, surely less than a mile away now. She was not going to be pleased with the news he was bringing. It verged on the alarming. He'd seriously underestimated the walk back to the petrol station. 90 minutes. And after all that, it was closed. Nothing else for miles and miles. 1 in the morning already, hours of night still to go. It was very, very cold. The petrol tank was a quarter full when he'd left her. How long could they afford to keep the heater running? She had never done well in the cold. He remembered a Christmas Eve in London, 5-6 years ago, walking down the Strand, she bundled up in layers, face squashed up in her scarf and hood, with that tuft of orange hair sticking out, a comic book rendition of Child in Winter, Tintin and Snowy. The two of them treating themselves to the city centre, tea at the Waldorf, skating at Somerset House, the narrow tip of her nose turning a delicate shade of blue. Snowy. This time there was no question of being half asleep. The voice was right there, not in his head, but right beside him, and his first thought was a pocket call on speaker, a freak patch of reception. In that black spot that covered the whole area, he fumbled one glove off, pulled out his phone. 0 bars, no record of a call. He tracked back, held his phone aloft. No bars. Snowy. And a stirring in the hedgerows, a rustling like the wind, although he felt no wind. He stood very still, heart beating hard, all of a sudden with a sense that he was not alone out here. Out here in the profound and now somehow listening quiet of deep countryside, deeper than anything back home. Hedgerows was a misnomer, implying neatly tended fields behind them, whereas these were simply the place where the forest met the road, edge rows with the American woods stretching wild beyond. Out here and not alone. He found that he was gripping his phone like a weapon. Blithe Brit honeymooner out in the woods in his trainers, feet cramping with cold, no bear spray. Not even sure if that was a thing. There is no bear, he scolded himself. Nothing bigger or more fatal than a man roams these woods. He imagined the noise that even a man would make, moving through the bushes and comparing it to the sound he'd heard, soft like the wind, except he had felt no wind, and forced himself to breathe, relax his grip on his phone, keep walking. Couldn't be far now. And the voice. It was interesting, he decided to decide. Some ancient part of his brain was coming alive out here in this deep, dark place, a primitive need to not be alone, conjuring up a comforting other. The voice itself was not scary. It was her. She was on his side and against the imagined bears and bogeymen, a hedge against the terrors of the night. The purely irrational terrors and a purely irrational hedge. Good to have that cleared up. It couldn't be far now. He walked faster, although it wouldn't do to run. Fast enough, though, that snow was shooting up his trouser legs and trickling down inside his trainers. Soon he'd be back in the car, thawing out his feet over the heater vents. Up ahead now was a darker stretch where tree branches met overhead. He remembered passing through this bit on the way out. First there'd been the deserted building, something between a shed and a barn, long-term abandoned, and then a minute later this dark tunnel. He remembered feeling a little spooked even then, first by the building, which he supposed, like any ruin seen by night, must have triggered something irrational. Watching. He felt it was watching him. Then the yawning trees, the darkness throat-like beneath them, not knowing how long it went on. This time, he knew the dark stretch was not long at all, and what lay beyond was a 5-minute walk past the ruin to his new wife, who would no doubt be disappointed, even angry. But the car would be warm, and someone was sure to come eventually. She'd wanted to stop when they passed the petrol station 4 hours ago in the different world before the accident. The suggestion had irritated him, fussing, backseat driving, typical. They had enough petrol easily to reach their destination. She seldom drove and was overcautious. Then the blowout, the swooping loss of traction, 2 seconds that stretched out like pulled putty. The car coming to rest, hood thrust into the low-spreading roadside trees, both of them straight ahead, staring straight ahead at the branches spackled across the unbroken windscreen. She broke the silence. I knew we should have stopped. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and asked what difference it would have made. She said she'd had a feeling. He breathed in and out once and got out to check the damage. Both front tyres. Even if he'd been able to fit a spare, they were a wheel short. He estimated a 45-minute walk back to the petrol station to get help. Quicker if he went alone. The thought of staying on her own with the car gave her another feeling. A bad one. He pointed out that he'd be quicker. She hated the cold, plus she'd have a better chance of flagging down any passing motorists if she stayed. A thought that had been nagging for expression ever since he passed the ruin on the way out now broke the surface. One of those vaguely new age dictums you might come across in fortune cookies or on the paper tags of yogic herbal tea bags. Something like, never set out on a journey leaving anger behind you because any parting might be your last. Too long for a tea bag tag, and it didn't quite have that air of smug wisdom nailed down the way he was phrasing it. Anyway, the walk to the petrol station and back didn't qualify as a journey. And it hadn't been a proper falling out, just one of those moments. It was only because this was their honeymoon and there had been a few too many of those moments. But then again, that idea of a honeymoon belonged to an earlier age. They'd been together for 11 years. A little bickering was perfectly normal. He was at the point now where the light from the tunnel's entrance was at its weakest and the other end had yet to heave into view. A very little light filtered through the branches above. Not much snow had made it through either, a dusting of icing sugar. And he had to squint to make out the ghostly tyre tracks in the dark. Snowy, snowy, snowy! Something brushed against his face, making him yell out the sound shockingly loud, scaring him more than her voice had done, more than the touch of the cobwebs. Lighter than that, more like a puff of wind. Although that wasn't right either. That didn't capture the sense of intention, like something struggling to gather itself out of thin air with a touch just for him. "Jesus!" he muttered, trying for rueful, coming out with panicked. He started to run. Now, he could see the end of the tunnel, the curving white line of the road, the curving black lines of the tyre tracks up ahead. The ruin crouched to one side. The sight of the ruin filled him with such dread that he almost stopped, but then, Snowy! It couldn't be her real physical voice. The car was still too far away, and the voice was right here. Quiet, but nonetheless strained to the limit, and so very sad. It was her. He could almost see her now, trembling in the air all around him. A desperate, effortful haunting. Drawing level with the ruin, he saw a set of footprints. Chunky, big man boots coming out of the ruin and merging with the near side tyre track. He ran, slipped, fell, up again, running. The car was round the next bend, hazard lights painting the trees and the road in a slow, sickly yellow strobe. He saw it, beached on the verge. The passenger side door was open, the interior lights on, and then his right foot was impaled by a hot lance. He screamed, hopped, and toppled. He clutched his foot, twisting it round to see the spindly tripod sticking out through the sole of his trainer, not understanding a dazzling flash of pain as he pulled it out. A warm rush of blood inside his shoe. He was holding a tripod of 3-inch nails, topped by another identical point, the one that had pierced him. A word came to him. Caltrops. More of them scattered across the road between here and the car. Top points stippling up through the snow, waiting to pierce a foot or a tyre. If he'd been the right sort of person, he might have checked the flat tyres more thoroughly, found something, realised. If he'd been another sort of person, he might have listened to her before. He left her alone. He'd left her alone in the dark. He'd left her alone in the dark, and nothing more fatal than a man roamed these woods. But what was more fatal than a man alone, lying in ambush in the dark American woods? He scrambled upright, gasping with the pain of each step, trying to imagine the sort of person who would, what? Grab a tire iron from the trunk, fight the monster. The car was empty. A chaos of scattered snow tracking from the open door into the black undergrowth. Her scarf looped like a signature over the hawthorn. He opened the trunk, scrabbling beneath the luggage. What even was a tire iron? He couldn't feel her anymore. Whatever had lingered, it was gone now. His mangled foot began to flutter uncontrollably. He sank to his knees, forehead resting against the cold sill of the trunk. After a while, he stood up and staggered down the trail into the woods. Overhead, clouds mopped up the moon and stars and began to shed a thick, new fall of snow.